Welcome to the meeting of the chapter of the Central Savannah River Area chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. My name is Ayman Fadl. Some of our officers are in the room. Randy Raymond, the Vice President with the camera, and Frank Frank Carl, he's our president. He just left the room to get some water for our guest speaker today. Our guest speaker is Mr. Robert Rivas. The presentation he's making is entitled, let me just pull up that information right here so I don't mess it up, Unconstitutional Restrictions on Your Right to Know About Assisted Suicide. And so I actually had a chance to hear from Robert earlier this year. He made a presentation at Maxwell, and he was gracious enough, he and Julia, his wife, in the front row here, to accept our invitation to come back again to Augusta, Georgia, and talk about this important issue. Robert Rivas is a member of Sachs and Kaplan. Is that exactly how? Okay. Based in the Tallahassee office of the Palm Beach County-based firm. Before entering the law school, Mr. Rivas was a reporter for the Miami Herald, a Peace Corps volunteer, a foreign correspondent in Central America and the Caribbean, and the deputy metro editor of the Palm Beach Post. He entered Nova Law School in 1988 and graduated summa cum laude in 1991. As a lawyer, Mr. Rivas has concentrated in First Amendment-related law for media and non-media, general civil litigation, and appeals. He first became involved in the Death with Dignity movement in 1996 as counsel in a joint ACLU Hemlock Society project that led to a landmark physician aid in dying case, McIver v. Krischer. More recently, as general counsel to Final Exit Network, which is the organization he's currently working with, he has overseen the defense of the network and its exit guides in civil and criminal cases in Arizona, Georgia, and Minnesota, along with spin-off investigations all across the country. He has engaged and overseen at least 24 other attorneys in the process. He has secured rulings from the Supreme Courts of Georgia and Minnesota that their state laws against, quote, assisting in a suicide, end quote, were unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So without further ado, I'd like Mr. Rivas to come and tell us about unconstitutional restrictions on your right to know about assisted suicide. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. Augusta's a pretty little town. I am going to speak today about the place where the right to death with dignity and the right to freedom of speech intersect and collide. It may seem like death with dignity, freedom of speech, what could they have to do with each other? It's not obvious why they would be in the same discussion. But you'll find that the intersection takes place where a state attempts to prohibit not only assisting in a suicide, which all states prohibit, but even talking to your loved ones about whether they make a rational choice to terminate their own suffering. I represent a nationwide volunteer group called Final Exit Network. You may have heard of Final Exit, a detailed do-it-yourself suicide manual first published in 1991. Final Exit is Final Exit Network's namesake. It was written by Derek Humphrey, one of the founders of the worldwide movement for the right to death with dignity, and one of the founders of Final Exit Network. As the network sees it, the right to death with dignity involves the right of a mentally competent adult who is enduring intolerable suffering to choose to die at the time and in the manner of his or her own choosing. If the time and manner of one's own choosing involves the hastening of one's death or inducing one's death before it otherwise would have happened, our society calls it suicide. As far as the network is concerned, it is not suicide for a competent adult to make a rational choice to terminate irreversible suffering. To me, suicide is the tragic death of someone who might otherwise have lived on with a satisfactory quality of life. suicidal people are tragically driven to suicide by a short-term emotional crisis. Our language has not adopted a word that describes the hastening of death by somebody who is not suicidal in that sense. Make no mistake, I'm not a supporter of suicide on demand, and I'm only talking about people who are not suicidal, who want to live, wish they could live, but have made a competently confirmed evaluation of their prospects and know that there's no way known in medical science for them to have a satisfactory quality of life, and who then therefore choose to terminate the suffering faster than nature would have, or God would have. Today I'm going to use the word suicide because that's how our law treats it. And I'll be talking about the law. Throughout history, suicide was condemned by most Western religions because God gave life and only God could take it away. Suffering at the end of life was seen as a ritualistic reliving of the suffering of Jesus at Golgotha. For nearly 2 millennia, people in the Western world didn't have any legally permissible option but to believe all that. Suicide was a crime at English common law. The punishment was to strip the decedent of any property he may have left to his heirs. Then his body was buried at a major crossroads out in the countryside. There, the faithful thought, the travelers pounding horse hooves and rolling wagon wheels would bother him for all eternity as they rode by. He could never rest in peace. Suicide is not a crime in our country today, but it's not exactly legal either. It's considered a major public health problem, and it is. And anyone considering suicide is legally assumed to be mentally ill and subject to involuntary institutionalization by the authorities, even people who are not suicidal and who are contemplating their own self-deliverance, because we don't make a distinction. Final Exit Network therefore has to work at protecting the beneficiaries of its services from being, shall we say, busted. Sometimes this leads its critics to say Final Exit Network is secretive or furtive. The fact is the network is a tax-exempt 501c3 authorized charitable organization that works proudly, openly, and publicly. The secrecy thing is limited to protecting the confidentiality of our members and to protecting them from being taken to the nearest mental health receiving center upon the discovery of what their plans are. Though suicide itself is not a crime, it is a crime in 39 states to assist, for one to assist another in a suicide. Now, before I get back to the Final Exit Network narrative, let me digress to talk about physician aid in dying, sometimes abbreviated as PAD, which also could stand for physician-assisted death. Same thing, PAD. The news media usually call this practice physician-assisted suicide. The term physician-assisted suicide was made up by opponents of PAD in order to make it sound perverse and evil. After all, could a physician really assist in a suicide? Sounds like an oxymoron, but only because of the baggage carried by the word suicide. Physician aid in dying is legal in 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont, where they have what they call death with dignity laws. Oregon and Washington passed theirs by voter initiatives in 1994 and 2008, and in Vermont, a courageous legislature passed such a law in 2013. In those 3 states, a person who is terminally ill may obtain a prescription from his doctor for a lethal dose of drugs, put him on a shelf, and use him later whenever he's ready. The PAD laws have extensive safeguards in place. The person may not avail himself of the PAD laws unless a doctor has certified within a reasonable degree of medical probability that the patient has less than 6 months to live. That is the most commonly used legal definition of the words terminally ill, 6 months or less. Though physician aid in dying is a legal form of what you might call assisted suicide in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont, it's not the same thing as simply saying assisted suicide. People often mix up PAD, where they use the terms to say assisted suicide is legal in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. That's not exactly true. If one assists another in suicide in Oregon and Washington, Vermont happens to be one of the states that has no law against assisting in suicide, so set that aside. But in Oregon and Washington, there's a law just like the one in Georgia, just like the one in Florida, that says if one assists another in a suicide, it's a crime. So the point is that in those 3 states, under their death with dignity laws, the only time anybody can assist in a suicide, and it not be a felony, is when it's done by a doctor under the death with dignity laws, strictures and requirements and regulations. Anybody acting outside of that framework is still a felon. Final Exit Network originated as the Hemlock Society in the 1980s. Volunteers of Final Exit Network, called exit guides, provide information, education, and moral support to carefully screened people who seek to terminate their own suffering. When a person attempts to die because of terrible suffering, there's nothing worse than a botched attempt. They may be forced to live on in a worse condition. Exit guides teach people how to ensure that their self-deliverance will be quick, peaceful, painless, and effective. Their mantra is that nobody should ever have to die alone or die a traumatic death. Exit guides are thoroughly trained. The network pays all their expenses. A network member who needs the network's exit guide services is not charged anything. There are about 3,000 network members. They pay annual dues of $50, $75 for a couple. Those annual dues payments are not directly connected to exit guide services. Most network members are not contemplating their own deaths at this time at all, but pay their annual dues to support the network's work. You can sign up to join at www.finalexitnetwork.org. There's my commercial. There's the PSA. To obtain exit guide services, a network member must submit an application for exit guide support, including medical records. A medical evaluation committee composed of 3 doctors evaluates the application to confirm that the applicant has no reasonable hope of finding relief from their suffering by any currently available medical treatment. So, for instance, if the doctors look at the medical documentation and determine that the person's real problem is they're not getting good pain relief treatment, which a lot of people who are in extremis are not getting good pain relief treatment, they're referred to a pain specialist, and they're not given exit guide services. But the network refuses to be bound by this 6-month terminally ill definition that I mentioned a while ago. So for that reason, some people say, oh, the network's bad. Critics say, oh, the network's bad because the network goes around assisting people in suicides. They always say that we do that, and we don't. But they say the network goes around assisting people in suicides even if they're not terminal. They make it sound as if it's like on demand, but it's just a distinction over whether to accept that 6-month concept. But the 6-month definition would automatically exclude people who are dying from, for instance, Lou Gehrig's disease, to name one of many. They may lose certain functions before one can say they have only 6 months left to live. Under the Oregon, Washington, and Vermont laws, they have to be capable of swallowing and ingesting the pills on their own. They can't be injected. They have to be able to do it. A person dying of ALS may, much more than 6 months out from the time of their natural death, no longer be able to swallow. Moreover, as time progresses, depending on the disease, some may no longer be competent to make the decision. At the network, we refer to a window of opportunity. In order to obtain exit guide support, a person has to be mentally competent and physically capable of accomplishing her own death. So they have to choose to die at a point where they can still carry it out. Otherwise, they'll find themselves sentenced to a long, slow death during which they cannot terminate their suffering. and the network would never support the death of someone who is not fully competent at that time to choose to hasten their own death. That's why the network, in certain carefully evaluated cases, is even willing to support the self-deliverance of someone with advancing dementia. The network does not commit the crime of aiding or assisting in a suicide. We educate people about how to do it themselves, and we often participate in a rehearsal. We'll be at the bedside at some other time, at the time of the death, to provide emotional support, but we will not lift a finger to assist. Exit guides are trained. Don't touch anything, and don't bring anything with you. So our exit guides need not have any fear of being arrested, right? Common sense? If only it were so.
Okay, what's the catch?
The catch is, in 2008, beginning in 2008 and into 2009, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation conducted an undercover sting operation. They had an undercover agent infiltrate the network pretending to be dying of cancer. This 50-ish guy, they even manufactured phony medical records for him. After meeting with exit guides, the man pulled a gun on them and announced their arrest, and the house was then surrounded by GBI agents with their guns drawn. I mean, they acted like they believed that they were about to be under assault with assault rifles, but who knows what kind of criminal. Most Final Exit Network volunteers are on the agent side. You know, we joke about them being geriatric volunteers. These are not people who were a threat to the cops. But nonetheless, they do things the way they got to do them. After making the arrests, they put out press releases saying that they had busted, quote, an underground, nationwide assisted suicide ring. I love that ring word. Calling all our geezers a ring is really special. The GBI put out racketeering seizure orders, and in banks seized $334,786. I just happen to have it written down right here. $786.08 of the network's funds, and fanned out across the country. They arrested 4 volunteers, 2 north of Atlanta in Forsyth, and 2 in Baltimore. And they executed search warrants and ransacked the homes maliciously of 14 network members in Atlanta, Baltimore, Sarasota, Florida, Ann Arbor, Michigan, St. Louis, I just happen to have the list here, St. Louis, Missouri, Mason, Ohio, Aurora, Colorado, and Missoula, Montana. It was February 25th, 2009. The GBI called this Bust Day. In internal documents I obtained much later, I learned that the GBI's plan was for Bust Day was to dismantle, that was the word they kept using, the network that day. They thought Bust Day would be the network's last day. I paused to reflect on the idea that a government agency that's supposed to be involved in law enforcement thinks that its function in society is to dismantle an organization one day because they decided to do that without a trial, without so much as an application to a judge, with nothing except that that's what they meant to do that day. Didn't work. A lot of people in the network thought that they had succeeded for a brief while. All exits were suspended. Everything was suspended. We started having to regroup. They called me frantically, and I suddenly became partly, at least in part, I suddenly became a criminal defense lawyer. I had never done that before. Let's just say I took a crash course. The GBI charged the network and 4 of its volunteers with racketeering.
Well,
The same crime.
They had to have something. They had to have something.
They had to have something. Well, you know, you commit assisting in suicide 2 times, and you can call it racketeering. You got 2 crimes committed by a group of people, racketeering. That's their thought process. But it is the same crime as you normally find only being committed by drug smugglers and mafiosi. Our old-timers actually faced life sentences. It was almost darkly funny. I don't know if any of you will remember this, but there was an old classic comedy called Going in Style. Art Carney and George Burns played as two old guys who got tired of sitting around on a park bench and decided to liven up their lives by pulling off a major bank robbery. I just often thought of Going in Style when I thought of our old timers, committing all this racketeering. But it was not comical how much the GBI spent of your tax dollars. I can say that now that I'm in Georgia. Usually I'm not speaking in Georgia, but these were your own tax dollars. I mean, millions of them. You would have thought we were the Medellin cartel. Armed with all the network's confidential information about its members, lists, appointments, correspondence, the GBI went all around the country with this huge Excel spreadsheet, names, addresses, went all around the country and tried to get other law enforcement agencies to initiate prosecutions of the network, sort of on the theory that if we get others to pile on, then we'll be sure to tackle this monstrous racketeering organization. Their efforts were a complete failure with every other law enforcement agency in America, and there were hundreds, with one exception. Put that in the back of your mind and we'll get back to that one exception. I organized a team of the best defense lawyers in Atlanta. For this cause, the best defense lawyers in Atlanta were eager to participate at incredibly reduced rates. These are the guys that pull down 7 figures to represent people who were busted in the topless bar operation, stuff like that. These great criminal defense lawyers. But there never was a trial in the Georgia case. Normally, an appeal can't take place until after a trial, but in certain peculiar circumstances, there is procedurally a mechanism for a court, for somebody to take an appeal before a trial to address a really important issue in a case. It's called an interlocutory appeal. So remember that name too. We'll get back to interlocutory appeals. In the Georgia case, we were allowed to take an interlocutory appeal on whether in Georgia, the Georgia statute was unconstitutional on its face under the First Amendment. And I personally handled the appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. During oral argument in the Georgia Supreme Court, I stood before 7 very skeptical justices. Very skeptical at first. We got into a little bit, and you could sense a seismic shift in the room as one by one the justices all began to realize that we were right. And the state's argument was so bad that the justices began shaking their heads. In the end, they unanimously declared the Georgia law unconstitutional under the First Amendment and dismissed all the charges against all the final exit network people. Which brings us to Minnesota. I said a while ago, the GBI went around the country trying to foment prosecutions, and there was only one place where they succeeded in fomenting a prosecution. Only one law enforcement officer in America took the bait. It was the DA in a little Minnesota town called Hastings on the Mississippi River. The local DA is widely known by the whole community of judges and lawyers to be a publicity hound. In most of the 39 states where aiding or assisting in a suicide is a crime, the law merely says it's a crime to aid or assist in a suicide. In 6 of them, however, including the one in Minnesota, the law says it's a crime not only to aid or assist in a suicide, but also to encourage a suicide or to advise about suicide. Now, I hasten to add, the network does not encourage anyone to commit suicide. The network does not advise anyone in favor of suicide. But the words encourage and advise are broad and vague. To encourage may mean to try to talk someone into something, but it also means to inspire one with courage. If you give somebody information and you inspire them to the realization that they can indeed accomplish any feat. you encouraged them, even if you didn't try to talk them into doing it. Giving somebody information is also advising. You know, I can say, advise means, as your lawyer, I advise you to remain silent. Well, that's affirmative advice, but also to advise somebody is just tell somebody something, anything. So with those words in mind, as defined that way, the Minnesota charges were based solely on the exit guides providing information, education, and moral support to a suffering Final Exit Network member in Apple Valley, Minnesota. And the state openly acknowledged that it had no evidence of any actual assisting. After the indictment, we filed a motion to dismiss the charges, which the trial court granted in part, holding that the Minnesota statute was indeed unconstitutional, prohibited by the First Amendment to the extent of the words encouraging and advising. Those words can't be in the statute. It's got to say assisting in a suicide is a crime. It can't say advising or encouraging a suicide is a crime, because that just incorporates speech and makes it a crime to commit the speech alone without assisting. So once the trial court ruled that way, though no trial had taken place, the state was allowed to take, here again we have an interlocutory appeal. No trial yet, took an interlocutory appeal of the ruling to the Intermediate Court of Appeals of Minnesota. I argued in the Court of Appeals of Minnesota that the trial court's ruling was correct under the First Amendment. One of the judges on the Court of Appeals leaned forward, looked over her spectacles during the argument as the attorney representing the state was making his pitch, and asked the attorney for the government, "So you mean to tell me that if I visit my elderly mother on her deathbed and tell her that she could pass on more quickly and peacefully if she stopped eating, I would be committing a felony under this law?" The lawyer who represented the state stammered and evaded and moved on without answering her question, and I think he lost her vote at that moment. So now you see where the First Amendment protected right to free speech intersects with the right to death with dignity. The judge put her finger on it. You have to be able to talk about it in order to make informed decisions about death with dignity. The Court of Appeals of Minnesota unanimously held that we were right and the law was unconstitutional. So the state appealed to the Supreme Court of Minnesota. Now, at this particular time, it just so happened that the Supreme Court of Minnesota was considering a case, the case of a guy named William Francis Melkert Dinkle. Mr. Melkert Dinkle appeared to be a perfectly ordinary, middle-aged, middle-class, white guy with a wife and daughter in suburban St. Paul. But he had a secret. He liked to go online and hang out in internet chat rooms that were populated by troubled teenagers who were talking to each other about their troubles. And among them are very commonly suicidal teenagers. And then he pretended to be a mentally disturbed young girl who wanted to commit suicide herself. And he tried to talk real suicidal young people into making a suicide pact with him. In his pitch to them, both of them would commit suicide at the same time by hanging. And they would watch each other die on Skype. Of course, he really just wanted the thrill of watching somebody die. He wasn't going to get on no Skype and let anybody see that he was a, overweight, balding, pasty-faced St. Paul resident. So he was convicted of advising, encouraging, or assisting young people in England and Canada to commit suicide. Many of you may have heard the adage that bad facts make bad law. It's commonly said among lawyers and jurists. Well, Melkert Dinkle's case must have been the greatest proof of the adage in the history of the world, that bad facts make bad law. The good people of Minnesota wanted to put Melkert Dinkle under the jailhouse. The Supreme Court of Minnesota wanted badly to do something besides let him off on grounds that his speech was protected by the First Amendment. So here's what the Supreme Court of Minnesota did. They held that the words advise and encourage in the Minnesota statute were unconstitutional under the First Amendment. The explanation denies further review of the Final Exit Network case, sends it all back, sends us back to the trial court, sends Melker Dinkle back to his trial court. So we go back to the trial court, and the trial takes place in May, this past May. Took 2 weeks. We go in armed with these 4 established precedents by the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court decisions. Number 1, in interpreting Minnesota's statutory prohibition of assisting in a suicide, a court must protect people's First Amendment protected right to free speech about their own self-deliverance. That's part of the law now in Minnesota. A statute that makes it illegal to advise or encourage a suicide is unconstitutional because it prohibits the exercise of pure free speech. In order for anybody to be convicted, the state must charge and the jury must find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant actually assisted in the suicide, which means doing something besides just speech. And yet somehow the word assisting is redefined, and any speech that quote-unquote enables a suicide constitutes assisting. But wait, speech that tells somebody how to self-deliver is speech that enables a suicide. It's also speech that advises on a suicide. It's also speech that encourages a suicide. What's the difference? Is there a difference? I submit that there is not. A statute that makes it illegal to advise, encourage, or enable a suicide makes it a crime to give people specific information. Such a statute makes it a crime for me to hand you a copy of Final Exit at a time when you're contemplating your own self-deliverance. I have thus enabled your suicide in the complete absence of committing any assistance, because the laws define that as assistance. Final Exit Network, the corporation, went on trial in May. Now, the corporation and 4 exit guides were indicted back in 2012. In all this time since then, 1 individual defendant died. All the charges against another individual defendant, the one from Atlanta, Ted Goodwin, he was a former president of Final Exit Network. He was indicted for no reason except because he was the president, which is not grounds to indict somebody. He had to have something to do with this particular crime. So the court threw out charges against him, so we're down to 2. One of them had real bad health conditions, and the judge excused her from the trial. So she's still sort of in limbo. The other one, his trial was severed from the trial of the corporation, and he's scheduled to go on trial, if ever. It's an interesting and long story, but he may or may not ever go on trial, but it'll be down the road sometime if he does. So Final Exit Network, the corporation, goes on trial alone. Over my continuous, impassioned objections, months before the trial, motions, the trial court just would not hear it, instructed the jury to convict Final Exit Network for any speech that enabled a suicide, without requiring the state to offer any proof whatsoever of any assistance. There was no limit on what speech could support a conviction. It did not make any difference who said it, when it was said, whether it was said in person, on the phone, or by email. It didn't even matter whether anybody from Final Exit Network made the criminal speech at all. The jury was instructed to convict Final Exit Network not for reading Final Exit the book to the alleged victim, or giving her a copy. No, Final Exit Network was convicted in part for merely telling her where she could go online to download the book and read it herself. And folks, this is not an underground or illegal book. You can go download it from Amazon. You can go to Derek Humphrey's website, download it there. A hard copy is probably on the shelf at some bookstore within 10 miles of us right now, on the shelf. And if it's not, you can get any bookstore in the Augusta area to order it for you. So when Final Exit Networks were dealing in Minnesota with a competent adult woman who was contemplating her own self-deliverance, it was a crime to give her this information, where to find the book. And guess what else is a crime? In Minnesota, if your father's dying of a long, slow, painful death, and he wants to terminate his suffering, and he has plenty of morphine available to him, and he asks, how much of this do I need to take to fall asleep tonight and never wake up? And you respect his choice. See what he's going through, you understand he's making what's the right choice for him. And you respect his values. So you look it up, and you tell him exactly how much he needs to use, how many patches to put on, how much he needs to use. You've committed a felony. For giving him true, accurate, lawfully obtainable information and respecting his choice. If your mother's ready to pass on and you respect her choice and you explain that she could use VSED, the voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, it may sound awful at first, but with proper pain relief, VSED is a sound way to a means of self-deliverance. If you just tell her about it, you're a felon in Minnesota. So we're appealing the Minnesota conviction right now. Fortunately, Final Exit Network, being a corporation, couldn't go to jail, so Final Exit Network only had to pay a fine, and the maximum fine was $33,000. So we paid the fine. But we're under appeal. It will take years, the appeals. We have to make a stop at the Intermediate Court of Appeals of Minnesota. It will undoubtedly go from there to the Supreme Court of Minnesota. 1 year first court, another year second court. But the potential, the decision could potentially clarify the law in a way that would it would be resoundingly beneficial to the right to free speech for all Americans across the country. If a high court, when a high court, I'm so confident, rules that we're right about this, that you can't criminalize speech. If I'm right, if I prove right, the Minnesota conviction could be one of the best things that ever happened to Final Exit Network. And it could be a major step forward for the Right to Die movement. So I hope in your hearts you'll support us. With that, I thank you, and I can answer questions for as little or as much time as you like.
I know someone who worked with hospice and decided to quit eating, was given morphine because to make it more comfortable, and that's how he died. Was that illegal in Georgia? This happened in Georgia.
It's not illegal to commit suicide anywhere in America.
So that would be considered committing suicide. He
That
was
would be considered
95 years old, and he decided it was time to go, and that's what he did.
It's called VSED, for voluntary stopping of eating and drinking.
And then he was
Like I
given
said,
morphine to ease the discomfort.
It sounds horrible, and it could be horrible, but with proper pain relief and with nursing to keep your mouth from getting chapped, and it is not a terrible way to die. And in fact, there are major organizations in America that endorse it and support it and teach about how to do it. You have to be, in order to do it properly, you have to be in hospice, because you need to have the morphine given to you.
So
And hospice will facilitate that. I believe that if they tell them in advance that you're going to do it, they'll try to talk you out of it. But if you're halfway along in the process and you call hospice and say, I'm going to die soon, I haven't had anything to eat or drink for X length of time, they will come out of compassion and give you the services you need.
No, apparently that's how he did it.
I was just going to add to what you said about being in hospice. If you're not in hospice, there have been several cases that have been reported in the news where families have had elderly members that died from starvation and not drinking. And it's questionable whether, going by what the history of the person was, whether they did this at home and these people were trying to keep them comfortable, but the people were arrested. So the advice about going into hospice is probably absolutely necessary. You know, they count it as elder abuse or abuse of the disabled if you do it at home and there's somebody that knows about it.
This happened in Georgia.
Yeah, there's been several cases in the news.
People
There's been two
who
local.
died and they were found to have been malnourished after they were dead.
Yeah.
And then
And
somebody
there were
was
family
charged.
members that were charged. And I know because my son is a first responder, he's with the fire department, but a medic first responder, and he has gone to the home of one of those victims that,
That's very interesting. I'd like to learn more about those.
well, I
cases.
can't give you the names for
But will
them.
you tip me off? I can find them on Google from news coverage. Was there news coverage of these situations?
Yeah, but I do know that the one, it was questionable, because Jay was pretty sure that in that one case, the other one might have just been neglect, but in the one case at least, he felt that, you know, they were just helping him die.
Yeah, I mean,
Quite elderly man.
anybody that starves grandpa to death involuntarily certainly needs to go to jail for that. But on the other hand, I could see how an abuse charge could be lodged in a case where somebody made a
Well,
intelligent choice.
I would just, you know, I've already let him know that if anything happens, I'm gonna go to hospice to die. I'm just saying that that is your best bet if you know, because there will be no question in a case like that.
Hospice is terrific and at times utterly, totally indispensable.
Yeah.
People often think that the right to self-deliverance, to aid in dying, is inconsistent with hospice. There's no reason to think that at all.
No.
People who think that are mostly listening to hospice, which is deeply invested in denying that they cause people's deaths. Well, the fact is, you're required, in order to get in, you're required to sign an authorization for them to discontinue hydration and nutrition. You're required to sign an authorization for them to use as much morphine as they think you need. And this is why they're able to call and say, hey, mom's going to die within the next 24 hours, and they know very precisely when it's going to be, because they know very precisely what they're doing. They're going to put the person in a morphine coma, they're going to discontinue hydration, and the person's going to die from that. And they justify it legally and say it's different from assistance in death by the thin veneer of an explanation that they're using the morphine solely to diminish pain. And if that's the reason they're using it instead of to cause death, then that makes it okay. But in the law, if you do something that you know is going to have a certain result, you can't, in any other context, you can't justify it by saying, oh, but that was not my intention to do the illegal thing, I had a different intention. I mean, if you know something is going to happen as a result of a course of conduct, you're responsible for what happens because you knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Your intention doesn't make any difference. I can't think of a good example, but it's a very twisted version of the law for people to think that causing somebody's death in a morphine coma, in what we call terminal sedation, is not assisting in a suicide. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious when you were talking about the Minnesota case, or the case of the guy who was getting on the internet and doing the suicide
Dick.
pacts. Yeah.
MD for Mad Dog.
Yeah, how would you differentiate that? How would you, what kind of law would you, that would get that guy, but not get other people?
She's got it figured out.
I decided, when you were talking about him, they should prosecute him for fraud. He never had an intention. He was entering into an oral contract with those teenagers to commit suicide, and he had no intention of following his end of the bargain. That's fraud.
It was
Yeah, but
fraudulent
how
in a
do you
sense,
prove that?
but every fraud statute that I know of requires that you make off with somebody's property.
Yeah, and the thing of it is to me, it wouldn't make it any better,
Take
even if he
somebody's
did
property.
plan to commit suicide.
Don't you should consider the state of mind of the person wanting to commit suicide? There's a difference between
Exactly.
teenagers talking about dying than someone who's
Terminally
actually
ill.
dying of an illness. Can you just latch on there somehow that it's...
Well, I think that Minnesota can't get a conviction to melt her people. But I'll tell you how they
But there
could.
was this case with
There
that
is-
girl that talked her boyfriend into committing just
Yeah,
recently.
that girl hasn't been convicted.
That's the thing, yeah.
Wait and see.
Yeah,
You know, I don't know how she could be
because
convicted.
at the end, he is the one making the decision.
And that's in a state where they don't have a law against assisting in a suicide. The girl, you talking about the guy in the truck?
I just know it was some
Real recent?
girlfriend
Just a couple of months ago?
egging him on.
Yeah, told him to get back in the truck.
I don't know the details.
Well, the state has taken on the burden of proving by the charge they laid against her that she caused his death. That's different from assisting in a suicide.
Exactly.
In assisting in a suicide, you don't necessarily have to cause the person's death. The state doesn't have to prove that you caused the death. But there are some statutes, and I'm going to get back now to how the state could have convicted Melker Dinkel. They can't now because they have to enact a new statute. But there are many states that have a statute that says, not many. Offhand, I think I recall maybe 8 or 10. States that have statutes that say if somebody causes someone else to commit suicide, that's a felony. That means you don't have to provide any assistance. But the law defines it a little further and says, if you cause somebody to commit suicide by using a fiduciary relationship or arguing to them from a position of some kind of moral authority with some kind of undue influence, let's say you're the priest, you want the teenage boy to die because if he doesn't die, sooner or later he's going to testify about the crimes that the priest committed on the boy. He uses his priestly position to talk the boy into killing himself. That's not free speech. Because when you cause something by means of communication, and the law requires proof that you actually caused an event, that's different from speech. Causation means it's conduct instead of speech. So you could convict Melker Dinkel theoretically of causing the deaths if you could prove that he really did. The fact is, if you read the decision, you'll see that he didn't talk anybody into using hanging. He was campaigning to get people to hang themselves. None of them hung themselves. The people, their point in time when they did it was far separated from his chat room experience with them. It was perfectly clear. There's no way he could be convicted of a crime. He didn't cause it. They didn't follow his instructions. He didn't assist. He's just an awful person.
Sick guy, yeah.
He's just, I mean, once in a while there's a sick person out there who you wish they could put under the grave, and there's no legal basis to do it, so you just shun him.
Yeah, but because of him, it shouldn't be that others who are having a legitimate
Couldn't you make
should
bad-
be prevented from.
Bad facts make bad law. That's our problem.
couldn't you make the case that if you actively encourage somebody to actively encourage rather than assist, or like you could make a case that he was actively encouraging people to commit suicide who may not have been willing to do it.
The problem with that is that when you read the facts, there's no question about this. Their intention to commit suicide was there long before they ever heard of it.
Okay, yeah.
And they did not do anything in response to his communications. His communications didn't contribute anything to their thought processes or their plans. They didn't follow his instructions. They didn't do it at the time he suggested. Amen.
About final
Hey, man.
exits, final exit networks screening process for its services, for its exit guide services. We hear a lot now about NFL, like former NFL players, that they observe in themselves his behaviors changes, and they have the symptoms of the early symptoms of, and some of them have committed suicide. If there are obviously they're still physically, motor-wise, they don't have any impairment at all in the, so they can actually go get a gun and shoot themselves, and that's the most common thing they're doing. Is there any, categories of people that Final Exit Network won't assist in this, like for example, I don't know enough about this brain condition that these athletes are suffering from, but is that one of the conditions that Final Exit Network would assist somebody in what's called
Self-deliverance.
Self-deliverance, yes.
Yeah, we don't use the word assist.
I'm sorry. In
Support.
support,
assist.
pardon me.
Give our information, educational, and counseling service. We've never had anybody make a request like that. The doctors would have to just evaluate the facts pertaining to the particular condition. Nobody is approved unless it's established by the medical committee that they're suffering from something that can't be alleviated. It isn't going to be alleviated. So if this brain damage from concussions in football or car accidents or whatever, if brain damage from concussions causes symptoms years later that causes a person to have no quality of life, intolerable constant suffering that can't be alleviated, then according to the usual criteria of Final Exit Network, that person would be a candidate to be accepted into the Exit Guide program. But I don't know whether a person who has the concussion, the brain damage that's caused by multiple concussions, do they actually experience constant severe pain, or do they just have forgetfulness and bouts of depression? Or I don't know. That's what it would depend on. It would just anything that a knowledgeable doctor can look at and say, yeah, I know the science in the field, and there's no way that person's going to get better. There's no treatment that would make the person better. The person is now condemned to having a totally unsatisfactory quality of life till the day she dies. And in part, we have to define the totally unsatisfactory quality of life in the subjective way that that person interprets it as being. So in a way, it's not an objective criterion, but in another way, at least we have to establish to our own satisfaction that it's not just made up in their head. That one person may be able to take more than somebody else. With a competent adult who understands all the ramifications. I mean, just viscerally seems absurd to me to tell anybody our age who's had years to think about it, who's made a very conscious choice because of very serious debilitating conditions to terminate their own suffering. I don't understand what would make anybody think that it's anybody else's business to go tell them they can't.
Yeah.
Who tells them they can't?
No, I mean, why they're putting their dogs down because it's a humane thing to do, right?
I can think of one reason.
into that?
And the one reason is if you suffer like I do from a major suicidal depression, which, then that was constant thoughts, which is a medical condition. So if they are suffering because of physical, like cancer or degenerative diseases, yes, but fortunately for me, I was found. So I'm kind of on the fence. I'm for assisted suicide in those cases, you see what I'm saying? But I can understand the
Let me make
concerns.
some more remarks about that, but I wanted to get Carol's question.
Your comment was you couldn't understand, well, doesn't religion play a huge part in that they don't want people to have the right to terminate their life?
Well, that's the great white elephant in the room. I mean, it's all about somebody,
Yeah.
it's all about the religion of the people who founded these laws, kept them in place for thousands of years, and still keep them in place now. It's just their view that is what God's will is.
Yeah,
You can't talk to them. I mean, you can't say, wait a minute. If it was up to God, the person would have been dead a long time ago. The person's being kept alive now because
Exactly.
we
Of science.
thwarted God's efforts to kill him with 6
Yes.
heart attacks. We stopped God from killing him because of his diabetes.
or
We,
cancer.
we played God over and over again. It's like the play God thing is it's okay as long as it extends life. It's not okay if it allows life, if it allows God's will to take place. Go figure.
I just wanted to know, do you see any progression, in the state trying to put more laws on their books for assisted
As a matter of fact, I'm glad you asked that, because I neglected to mention that when talking about states where physician-assisted death is legal, is that California, both the House and the Senate have passed a bill in California. The bill has now been put on Jerry Brown's desk. It's been there, I don't know, 4 or 5 days now, I guess, since the middle of last week. And I believe he has a 10-day window to either sign it or veto it, or if there's a pocket veto in California where it takes effect without his signature, he can do that too. I understand he's so preoccupied with the fires, he's never told any news media, he's never revealed publicly whether he intends to sign it or not sign it, or what he thinks about it at all, one way or another.
But do you feel like, I mean, just a sense of people trying to push the legislature through?
There were more legislative initiatives introduced in 2015. Most legislatures meet in the spring. And all across the country in the spring this year, there were more legislative initiatives to have physician aid and dying bills than in any other year ever before. There were like 20, in the 20s, somewhere in the 20s, the number of states where they had serious efforts.
Of course, Georgia will do that.
And it's all probably a result of the death of Brittany Maynard.
Yeah.
You all remember the pretty young lady who had brain cancer and died under the Oregon law? She's probably the biggest source of the 2015 rash of bills. But on this subject of permanent mental illness, there's no question that some people have an absolutely an organic, incurable mental illness that drives them to extremely severe depression.
Well, it's a chemical imbalance is what it is.
Chemical,
It's a chemical
organic
imbalance, and that's what
chemical.
those children that he talked into committing suicide or that committed suicide for whatever reason, that's what they would have had. Which-
we don't know that. They may have just
No,
been upset.
I'm gonna tell you that, trust me, it's unnatural to be that young and have those kind of thoughts, and there are medicines and other things that get the chemicals back in
I think a
balance.
lot of people who are young
Yeah.
at that stage of their lives commit suicide when it was totally unnecessary and it wasn't driven by organic physical illness.
They're not even on your radar, are they?
Well,
To be considered?
psychiatry
No,
and most
but
actual
what I'm trying to
scientists
say
will
is that
disagree with
she-
that, but.
She's got a really good point though. There are people who have no physical ailments that would justify saying the person is suffering intolerably, but they're suffering intolerably because solely of mental illness.
Which is a chemical imbalance in the brain.
Yeah, which
So I
causes-
take 2 different medicines and I have no suicidal thoughts, I have no fears, I have no mood swings, I function perfectly normally. What I agree with, though, is that people who are suffering with these horrible, debilitating illnesses, and there is nothing you can do about it, cancer, and I mean, you're in the, well, I think if you want to not fight cancer at all, that's your business. Do you see what I'm saying? Because cancer has a very high likelihood of you not being successful anyway. So I agree with the physical illnesses, but I am glad that someone found me and that I am still alive to spend time with my family and my
Well, let me
grandchildren.
tell you why you never would have been given exit guide support from Final Exit Network based on what you've said. We have a policy. On one hand, the members of the board of Final Exit Network don't think it's right to completely exclude, to prohibit exit guide services in all cases from being provided to people with organic, permanent, lifelong, incurable and untreatable depression. There should be, they believe philosophically that there should be a category there for those people, because they exist. But in order to safeguard against somebody who is only experiencing a temporary depression being given exit guide services, the policy there's a written policy that is so strict, it requires that there be 20 continuous years of psychiatric treatment. It requires that every known treatment have been tried. It requires that every known treatment have been unsuccessful.
Oh, I'm not questioning that, I'm fully behind you.
I just want to finish explaining what it is
Yeah.
that Final Exit Network's policy is. And when all these circumstances converge, multiple hospitalizations, when all these circumstances converge, then it finally becomes clear that there is no there's no hope of this person having a better quality of life, then it would be theoretically possible for an exit guide to be assigned to somebody for a pure mental illness case in the absence of physical or applied and fulfilled the criteria necessary for Final Exit Network to do that. I'm over time. Let me ask, if
Frank, it's, well, couple more questions, quick ones.
I would just like to know if you ever had someone being diagnosed with Alzheimer's and decided because he's not in pain yet, it's not really.
yes.
So
The answer is yes, but the main reason is because of that window of opportunity thing. Sometimes if a diagnosis of Alzheimer's is perfectly clear, there's no question about the diagnosis, the validity of it, the person is definitely going to spiral soon into an intolerable state, and the person doesn't want to allow that to happen. Sometimes it just seems terrible for somebody to have to decide to end their lives, but if they want to do it while they're still competent, they have to do it while their relative physical condition seems like wrong for them to die. But that's the only way that they can do it in accordance with the law if they're going to die while they're still competent. So that Final Exit Network does support people in rare cases in that situation, but the only solution to that is way, way down the road. There's going to have to come a day when it's possible for somebody to sign documentation that says, I want to be euthanized when I am no longer competent and I can't do it myself, when the following conditions are fulfilled. I don't recognize my children, whatever it is, whatever the person wants to put in there. But that's not physician aid in dying. That's euthanasia.
A friend of mine actually committed suicide, and he was a physician because his mental capacity was deteriorating, and he was only 55 when he did it.
Those are the saddest cases.
Yeah, and
Early onset.
He was still competent to do it himself.
But he knew what was going to happen to him.
Exactly.
If he didn't do it while he could do it. It's a tragedy. And it wouldn't be necessary if the law was sane.
Right.
I say this stuff now here to you today, and I'm telling you, if the opponents of the right to physician aid in dying in California and in other states where this debate is raging learned that I said this, they would spread it around out there, and I don't care. They'll spread it around out there and say, look, this is proof that these people are all looking to go down the slippery slope.
Yep.
They want to go down the slippery slope toward euthanasia, as if that's a big scandal. Well, it ain't a scandal to me.
Do you have to be a member of that state in order to take the service?
You have to be a resident. They don't have minimum residency requirements. You don't have to live there for a minimum of 6 months. But you have to prove that you are a resident. That means you got to go there, you got to sign a lease on an apartment, you got to change your driver's license, you got to change your voter registration, you got to get armed with some things to prove that you have made a decision to be a permanent resident of that state. And it doesn't matter if you only moved in a week ago and did that, but you got to do all those things, and you got to cut your ties to your former state and prove that you are a resident of the state.
Is that what the young lady that had the incurable brain cancer did? I can't remember.
Yeah, she moved from
I
California
was thinking she moved.
to Washington State, or Oregon, I'm not sure which. I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but for the purpose of taking advantage of the law, she made herself a resident of the state. Brittany Maynard.
Thank you very much.